morning. Welcome to SMCC St. George. My name is Matt. I get to be one of your pastors here at the St. George campus. And today, we are going to be talking about something that we refer to as redemption. The word redemption, the theme of redemption, what we mean when we get into that. We're going to kind of define it a little bit this morning, but I want to start off by just giving us a basic working definition of what I mean when I say redemption. I think it gives us kind of a baseline for where we're headed with the message today. Redemption, the way we're defining it, is the solution to feeling less than or not enough, which is something that I think all of us have felt at some point in time. It's the solution to feeling less than, it's the solution to feeling not enough. There's more about redemption. We're going to get into that this morning, trust me. But that's what we're going to start this morning. And I wanted to start off today, and I'll just give you the warning. This is probably a little bit more than a PG message, just a tad more. So if there are children in the room, you've still got time to head out to children's ministry. It's okay. You're welcome here. It's up to your parents. But with that being said, I'm going to kind of jump in deep right off the bat this morning, just jump in feet first into this topic this morning. And I want to tell you guys something that maybe many of you know, some of you do know, I know that, and many of you don't, because maybe we haven't had the chance to have a personal conversation over the past few years that I've been working here. But for me, something that's been true about my life and where I've seen the theme of redemption play out more than anywhere else in my own walk with Jesus has been the fact that for me, for 10 years, I was addicted to pornography, about 8 years, going on 10 years, somewhere in that range. Doesn't really matter. The point is, for now, I have been away from that, been free through the grace of God for over 10 years, which is an incredible thing that's only, thank you, I appreciate it. It's a thing that's not possible because of me. Trust me, I tried to give up my vices, my addiction many times for me. I tried to give it up for other people, and it didn't work because I had to give it up for a bigger reason than that. But the reason I tell you guys this, the reason I start off this way this morning is because I had a lot of internalized guilt, a lot of internalized shame around the fact that I had been addicted to something as gross in my own mind as this for so long. And so when I started in 2019 looking for a church to apply to work at full time, I started sending out applications, and I swear my wife could probably attest to it, but I think I literally applied to over 100 different churches across the US. I was like, I'll go anywhere. I don't know. I just want to do this full time. This is what I want to do with my life. And at first, I had this voice inside of my head that was saying, don't even bother applying. Like, do you really think they want you to go speak to people on a Sunday morning? Do you think about how many times you stood on stage in youth group as someone hopelessly lost in your addiction to pornography and pretended like you weren't and preached to students? You want that guy to go pastor a church somewhere? You think that's going to work out well? This is the voice that was going on in my head, and I would put it off. I would think, no, that's not true. I've read my Bible. I know there's grace. I know that I'm not supposed to be bound by this shame. And then I would get messages back from church after church after church that I had applied to where they were like, ooh, we saw on your resume that you had worked with an organization that told students about the dangers of pornography for about a year, and we're not interested in that. I literally had one church that said, that's just not a problem that we want to talk about. It's not a problem that we want to deal with. And so immediately, again, the thoughts of like, you're too broken, you're not good enough, nobody's going to want to listen to you, crept immediately back into my life. And I really had a moment where I thought, I guess maybe the things I've done in the past were so heinous that I just can't work in a church, and I'm just supposed to work at a machine shop for the rest of my life, which is fine, by the way. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's what I was doing. And I thought maybe this is what it is. Maybe I'm just supposed to volunteer from time to time, and God is saying this is a closed door. You're just not good enough to do that. And I remember feeling broken. And the reason that this is important is because our need for redemption shows up in those type of statements. When we think to ourselves, I am too blank to blank. We'll put it up here on the screen behind me, but I'm too blank to do blank. For me, it was, I'm too broken to pastor. Nobody's going to want to hear what you have to say. You're just a hypocrite. You stand on stage and tell people they're supposed to get their lives together, and you preached for so long without your life getting together, and there's still issues that you have in your life, and all of this is going to hold you back. You're too broken to be a pastor. Or maybe for you, some of the other ones that I've felt before is you're too awkward to be in community. Don't go to small group. It's going to be awkward. You're weird. Don't go get involved in a group of people that's also weird. You don't want to get involved in that. It's just awkward. Stay at home. Don't get involved. Maybe you're too guilt-ridden to be joy-filled, too embarrassing to be a leader. I could go on and on. Maybe you're too successful to fail. I've felt that many times in my life, that inachievable standard as we work through the world and we think maybe we're just too good to fail. We're too something to do something else with our lives. And this is the place that we realize we need rescue. We need redemption, because while this isn't necessarily the thing that is true, it's not necessarily the thing that should hold us back in our lives, it comes from a place of honest thoughts, of honest recognition inside of ourselves. We're too broken, so therefore we can't go do these things. And so I want us to note this. I want us to take this statement of understanding that we need a rescuer, we need someone who can redeem us, and make it personal for us this morning. We can make it personal by saying this: we all need a redeemer. Every single person here needs a redeemer. I believe this to be fundamentally true of every human being, no matter where you are from, what background you have in your life. We are all in need of someone who can redeem us in some way. This is actually a word that we get in many ways from kind of a marketplace idea of the world, this idea of redemption. If you look at a soda bottle or a soda can, to this very day, you can find a redemptive value on there. It's usually like basically nothing. I don't know very many people that collect cans. If you do, let me know. I'll bring you cans and soda bottles or something. But with that being said, there's a redemptive value that we understand when something is trash to one person, it can still be redeemed for some sort of value to someone else. And so we have this cultural understanding of redemption. But today I want us to understand this. Redemption often works like this. Redemption is, I will pay because you can't. I will pay because you cannot. We're learning all about this from a very old, very powerful, poetic story through the story of Ruth in the Old Testament. And there's so much of this story that we've gone through over the past few weeks that rings true for me today. It rings true for many of us today. And yet it's been around for literally thousands of years, retold and retold, because there's something innately true about the core of the story that we see here, that we all need redemption, and we all have an understanding that we can't pay the debt that we have accrued. And so while this story in some ways is about a man and a woman who fall in love, and in some ways this story is about rags to riches, it's also very far from your Disney princess fairy tale story. There's some dirty, broken, difficult pieces that I believe serve to make this story even more powerful than it would have been if it was just written in some fairy tale narrative form where we couldn't understand. This is real people going through the real difficult work of redemption in their lives. And so the story of Ruth, as I've said, is really today's chapter 3, and it's really all about redemption, but the entire book in many cases is all about redemption. It's only 4 chapters. It's only 83 verses long, the entire book of Ruth. If you're someone who maybe hasn't read a book of the Bible, I would strongly encourage you can go home and read the book of Ruth this afternoon. It's really not that hard. You can do this one. I promise, you've got this. You can head home and do it because it's not very long, but in just the 83 verses that we see in the book of Ruth, 23 different times, we see the word redemption used. And the theme is carried out even more than that. In every micro aspect of this story is this theme of redemption. And so I think it gives us a clue as to what the major theme of the book as well as this chapter is. And like I said, I believe that to largely be redemption. So I want to give just a little bit of backstory on the book. In case you've missed the past few weeks, we're in chapter 3, so we're kind of about at the halfway point at the start of this morning through this book of 4 chapters. And so far, what we've seen is that this book that takes place in between a couple other books of the Bible, right after the book of Judges, if you're looking for it in your Old Testament, you'll find it right there. It is a book that is really good at telling us a story that if you didn't know what you were looking for, you would sit back, you would read it, and you would think, why is that in my Bible? I remember the first time I read Ruth, I thought, cool, great, a story that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I was really new to all of this, and I was like, okay, I get the Jesus thing, I get the Old Testament law thing, I get the stories, and then there's just Ruth in here for some reason, this random woman, this random story. Like, what does this have to do with anything? And the reason that this is in here, among many other things, is because it is telling us a story that is going to be replayed over and over and over again in the life of every single believer, and a story that ultimately comes to its fruition, its most important conclusion, in the life and death of Jesus Christ. And so I want us to dig into this, but what we have to understand is that this book falls right after the book of Judges. Now, in the book of Judges, we've just found out that the Israelite people don't have a king. They're looking for a king. They would like to have someone who can rule over them, but they don't currently have a king. And so they are kind of left in this limbo where they have rulers who are judges who are kind of sometimes doing things okay. I don't know if I would ever say super well, but they're definitely falling apart at the seams more often than not. And into this background setting is where Ruth and her story steps onto the scene. We also see that because of what's been going on here, whether it's in part because of poor leadership or various other agricultural settings and problems that are going on, that there's a famine that has caused Ruth and her family to move from where they were to go in search of food. And during this process, where Ruth is moving with her husband and her brother's husband and his wife and her mother-in-law, the men all have some sort of accident that we're not privy to exactly what happens, some sort of accident, and all of the men end up dying. And so now you have Ruth, who, by the way, is a Moabite, which we'll get into, or sorry, not a Moabite. She's a descendant of Sodom. She's from Moab, so you could get there, but one way or the other. She has kind of found herself in this circumstance where she's out of place. She's in a place where she's not considered good enough in and of herself, and now she's supposed to be taking care of her mother-in-law, and her mother-in-law's trying to tell her, you don't really have to do this, and she keeps fighting back and forth. And so over the past few weeks, we've seen this relationship grow between Naomi, her mother-in-law, and Ruth. We've seen the complexities bloom in this story. And then last week, Pastor Tom introduced us to this idea where all of the sudden Ruth is out gleaning in a field, taking a little bit of food that she needs, and she runs into a man who might be able to do something about her current predicament. But what I want us to understand, what we understand so far from this book, is that if we go back to our beginning statements about being to something to do something else, we could see that Ruth is a perfect embodiment of these type of statements. You see, Ruth was too dirty to belong in Israel. She's a Moabite. She doesn't fit in. She's out of place. She, as I stated, she's a descendant of Sodom. Yes, that Sodom, like Sodom and Gomorrah Sodom, not a good place that you want to be from. She is from a bad, vile people group, is how the Israelites would have seen her. So she's an outcast. She doesn't fit in. She's too dirty to belong in Israel. Ruth was too broken to be loved. She's a widow. She's damaged goods. She doesn't have anything to offer anyone. She's not a virgin anymore. There's nothing she can give in this cultural setting. Ruth was too impoverished to be valued. She's from another land. She doesn't have a man to provide for her. There is nothing going on that is going well in her life at this point in time. Naomi is too old to work, too old to marry, and too old to have children, which, whether you like it or not, at this point in history was basically the only job that she could possibly have. And so we see two women who are going to fully understand this idea of feeling like they're not good enough. They feel like they have no value because culturally they have no value. And yet this idea of having value has to be a prerequisite for redemption, as we've laid it out this morning. And so I want us to understand as we continue on that there's a lot of things that happen in this story that prove the worth, they prove the value that God has bestowed upon these two women. And so continuing on, I want us to jump back into the story. Last week, Tom gave us a little bit of a conversation, Pastor Tom, where we started understanding that Ruth meets Boaz. What's happened from there is there's about 7 weeks where Ruth goes without hearing from Boaz. She just completely gets ghosted. If you've ever had that happen, I'm sure maybe some of us in the room have had this experience. It doesn't feel good. It's not a thing you want to experience in your life. You think the relationship's going well, and then all of a sudden you don't hear anything back. And while this could be a good place to talk about some sort of funny, joking, dating circumstance. This story is far from just a romantic comedy. There's a lot more that's going on in the story of Ruth. And so I want us to kind of understand this. Ruth 3, verse 1 says this. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." Now again, you've got to remember they have nothing at this point in time. And Naomi knows about this unique provision in Israel, this unique idea of a marriage that it has this law term that's going to allow her to be able to marry her brother-in-law. It's a levirate marriage, and it allows her to be able to go and actually marry her brother-in-law in a legal sense, and also because this is the provision that has been given for her. The first section of this levir word is Latin for the husband's brother. And in ancient times, if a man died without a child, it was common for the bride to go marry his brother, and that if they had a child, if they were to conceive a child, that child would legally be the heir to everything that the original husband had. Super strange, like I said, it's a weird one, but it's absolutely something that is in Scripture. It's absolutely something that we understand. And so a widow could marry a brother-in-law, and the first son that would be produced of that union was considered to be the legal descendant of her dead husband. It was called a kinsman redeemer. In Hebrew, we have this beautiful word, goel, which is, again, a reiteration of this point. Someone who redeems you even though you are in a broken and helpless place. And so continuing into reading what Ruth says here, I want us to note this. Ruth 3, 2 through 5, it says this. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know that you're there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he's lying, and then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So this is a strange section of Scripture. We're going to dig into what's happening here a little bit more in just a few minutes. Like I said, it's a little bit more than a PG message this morning, but we'll get there. They devise a plan is the basic point of what's happening here, and Ruth is going to go get cleaned up. She's going to fix her hair. She's going to take a shower. She's getting ready for her date night. And most of what's happening here in a lot of ways is Ruth symbolizing that even though she is a widow, even though that the culture may view her as damaged goods, she's about to go signal to everyone here that she's available. But she's not trying to just signal it to anyone. She's not just going out trying to catch a man. She's going out trying to find Boaz. But she's giving the signal that she is back on the market and she's looking for Boaz. Now, there's something I want us to note, and this is important. It's about the threshing floor. This place is an interesting site. I think we've got a picture of it. There we go. Thank you. Appreciate it. We've got this place that's referred to as the threshing floor. This is a place of work, but it's also a place where a lot of unsavory things happen. And I want to read to us Hosea 9:1. It gives us some context for what we understand the threshing floor to be. Hosea 9:1 says, "Do not rejoice, Israel. Do not be jubilant like the other nations, for you have been unfaithful to your God. You love the wages of a prostitute at every threshing floor." So the setting here in what's being told in this story of Ruth is that it's harvest season. There's a lot of work to be done. Boaz is headed into his threshing floor, as we just saw, to go work hard throughout the day. And I would have to imagine, because as previously stated, I've worked in a machine shop, I've worked out in the blue-collar world, that during the day, while there's hard work and sweat and anger and things flying around, that this is probably not the type of place that you would want to just find yourself. There's probably lots of conversations that are less than savory. There's probably lots of language that we wouldn't say from a stage on Sunday morning. There's a lot of things happening in this area just during the day that don't set it up to be a perfect place for redemption. But then, when the work is done and the day is over and these men are completely exhausted and far away from home, what else are they going to do but get drunk and sleep with a bunch of prostitutes? That's what we know the threshing floor to predominantly be used for at the end of the day. And so I say all of this to say this is an incredibly unlikely place for this redemption story to take place, for this redemption story to start. I think there's so much that mirrors our relationship with Jesus, where I know in my life, it's certainly an unlikely place for God to decide to use me with all of my brokenness, with all of my flaws. To be able to use that broken person is incredible, and he's telling the same story thousands of years before that. This story is getting kind of weird, though. There's some strange stuff happening here in chapter 3. Naomi tells her daughter-in-law, do whatever he tells you. Just not advice that I'm giving to my daughter when she goes on dates anytime soon. Just not gonna happen. No, in fact, do the opposite of everything he tells you is probably more accurate to what I'm gonna tell my daughter. But this is what Naomi says. She says, do anything he tells you. It's a little bit different. This whole story, however, is a little bit different. Ruth is a little bit different. She's a woman of high integrity, a woman of tons of courage. She's an immigrant. She's been grieving, and she's loyal to her mother-in-law, even though there's very little reason to do so. And she's also seen Boaz's character. She's seen that he's not a man who seems to be wasting his time on alcohol and prostitutes, that he's a man who is worthy of something else. And so I've heard plenty of interpretations on this next passage that I'm going to read, and we don't know exactly what happened here. We'll dig into a couple different things, but I want to read this for us. This is Ruth 3, 6 through 9. It says this. So she went down to the threshing floor, and she did everything that her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and he was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, she uncovered his feet, and she lay down with him. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, so he turned, and there was a woman laying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. Now, like I said, there's some different interpretations of what this exact moment, what's happening, whether there's something wink-wink kind of sexual going on here or not. We don't know for certain, but what I can undoubtedly say is that one way or the other, we've already seen it proved that God is using a strange circumstance to bring something good out of it, something that we wouldn't contextualize typically as clean and easy to understand and easy to digest and preach to masses of people. Something strange. And past that, the main point of what's being said here has very little to do with the specifics of what happened on the threshing floor that night, and a ton to do with this ending statement that she makes. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are my guardian redeemer for our family. We don't know what happened here for sure, but we know that Ruth needs redemption, and she knows that she needs redemption. She's in an unlikely place where her character is under a microscope, and it's on display with her deep desire to honor God and her family. And the thing that she says is, redeem me. Cover your blanket over me, redeem me, bring me back, because I need a redeemer. I need someone to step in and pay the price that I can't pay. Now, in Old Testament law, this would have been known as a marriage proposal. It just absolutely would have been. This idea of saying, cover me with your garment, is truly like an ancient way of proposing. Let's tie the knot. Let's go do this thing. Let's get married, because I need someone to pay for me. I need someone to redeem me. I need your redemption. It's a declaration far less about romance and sex, and a declaration far more about rescue. She's well aware of her state. She's well aware of who can save her, and she asks that of Boaz. So let's cover a little bit more in detail. The macro of this story is coming, I promise, but let's cover a little bit more in detail here. Ruth 3:10 says this. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it's true that I am a guardian redeemer of your family, there is another who is more closely related than I. So stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good. Let him redeem you. But if he's not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until the morning. She lay at his feet until the morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, no one must know that a woman had come to the threshing floor. He also said, bring me the shawl that you're wearing and hold it out. When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town. This text shows us the noble character of Boaz and Ruth. We see a lot about who they are as people unveiled in this section. We see as the details play out that he cares about her enough to say, leave quietly, because this is sort of like going to like the part in town that you're not supposed to go to and waking up in the morning and having to make an awkward walk of shame back. And he doesn't want her to have to do this. He says, I don't want people talking about you and thinking that you did something here that degraded this type of morals that we're talking about here. I want you to go back to your place without having to be asked these type of questions. And so he gives her this gift of 6 measures of barley. We don't know exactly what kind of measures there were. There are some measures that existed back then that would have been really tiny, and so it definitely doesn't seem to be that. And the only historical document we have otherwise would have been about a truckload, and I'm pretty confident she didn't carry a truckload of barley attached to her. I could be wrong, but we don't know. But we do know there's a lot of symbolism happening in this story, and we'll continue. I want us to continue by wrapping up this chapter, and we'll get back to this. But Ruth 3:16 through 18 puts it this way. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, how did it go, my daughter? Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. So we'll have to pause here in this section of the story. It's kind of a cliffhanger for next week when Pastor Tom comes back to wrap up this message and go through chapter 4. But I want us to note this. The threshing floor was a place of prostitution, not redemption. This was a place that often housed debauchery. This wasn't like going to church so that you can go get filled and have redemption and feel good about yourself. This was a broken and difficult place to be. And so when we realize this and we put this in context here, it leaves us with a huge question that I think all of us should be wondering in some circumstance, which is, what do I do with this story? What is the ultimate meaning for me that this story gives? And I've heard a couple different interpretations this week and over the past few weeks while digging into this text. I heard a pastor who said that the ultimate bottom line of chapter 3 of Ruth is that if you want to meet godly people, you have to go where godly people are. That's not technically a wrong point. It doesn't make any sense in context of this book, but that's beside the point. So I don't think that's it. So I kept digging, I kept searching a little bit more. I saw that there's another pastor who says there's not a lot of Boazes out there, so don't be like Ruth, which is a weird point to throw out. I heard another pastor say, ladies, you'll find your Boaz someday. Just keep waiting, just keep looking. None of that is the point of this beautiful, ancient piece of art that gives us an incredible narrative that we can learn from. Not one piece of what was said there is the ultimate bottom line, because what we see here has so much less to do with this story that whispers about love and romance, and so much more to do with beckoning us into our need for redemption in our own lives. If this story serves to do anything, it shouldn't be read like a romantic comedy from 2,000 years ago where there's some awkward moments and cheeky things that are happening and we don't really know all the things that are going on. We should read this story and understand that this is a narrative story about the redemption of one woman who ultimately leads to the redemption of a nation and ultimately leads to our Redeemer ourselves. Matthew 1:5-6 says this, Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary, who is the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. It's one of those sections of scripture that I used to read through and get really bored because it's just naming people who begot somebody else, who begot somebody else, who begot somebody else. And I was like, okay, I get it. There's like a family tree. Couldn't you put that in the beginning of the Bible? I didn't have to read it here. Like, why are you doing this again? This is a beautiful and celebratory note in the Bible to say these are broken people. The story that we see is Ruth is redeemed through Boaz, and it allows Ruth to become someone who is the great grandmother of King David, who ultimately leads the entire line of people leading up to Jesus, our ultimate Redeemer. So Ruth shows us that God is working, bringing a king to Israel in the most unlikely of ways, but he still fulfills it. The redemption of Ruth through Boaz sets up the redemption of the world through Jesus. I want us to take that in and just think about it for a moment. The redemption of Ruth through Boaz sets up a line of events that allows for King David to become the king of Israel, that allows for him to continue on the line where Jesus, our ultimate redeemer, comes about. And so this redemption sets up the redemption of the world through Jesus. It also, it foreshadows what Jesus is about to do for us. Ephesians 1, 7-8 says it this way: in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins in accordance with the riches of God's grace that he has lavished on us. Not on the threshing floor do we call out for the redemption of Jesus, but at the foot of the cross, another unlikely place that doesn't seem to be where we should be looking for redemption. Another broken place that is reserved for criminals, is reserved for the worst of the worst to be hung and put out on display. And yet this is the place that Jesus decides to be the propitiation, the redemption for our sins. The cross was a place of humiliation, not redemption. I think all throughout the Old Testament into the New Testament, we see this continual theme of God using the most unlikely people in the most unlikely places to accomplish his work. And I am proud to continue to be part of that. I appreciate you as a church for accepting me and for being part of my redemption story, for allowing me to use the gifts that God has given me. Even though I've come from a broken place, I appreciate this. And I want us to read this. This is this idea of what is happening here, this cross being an unlikely place for the redemption to play out. We could ask the same thing. We could say the same thing to Jesus that Ruth says to Boaz. And may we do that with our lives today. Jesus, redeem me by paying for my sin because I can't pay for it myself. Can we say this? What's keeping us from saying this? What's the thing that holds us back in our lives from saying, you know what? I can't do this myself. I can't pay for this myself. I need redemption. What stops us from asking the same thing of Jesus that Ruth asks of Boaz and going forward in our lives today? And if we can do this, we can accept that Jesus is the one who has paid for us with his life, then we also have to accept that we are worth everything to him, that we have been given inherent value because of the redemption value that Christ has put on us. It makes us live our lives in a completely different way than we lived them before. And one part of that I want us to note was this week I was scrolling through my Facebook, and I came across this autobiographical blog that has been going around. I think it's the second most shared, second most read article in the US this week. And so I want to take just a second to talk about this, because often when we get to redemption, when we talk about redemption, it can be a theological topic that, while I think is incredibly important and incredibly difficult for us to truly grasp and put out in our lives, it can also feel like it's just a warm hug and we don't have anything else that we should go do with it. We can go back to lunch today and we can go, cool, I'm redeemed, and go to lunch, and then we can go back to our life and we don't have to think about it. And I want to challenge us this week to dig in further, to not just cozy up to this easy to digest theology, but to jump in, to stop playing church and truly have an understanding of what this means for our lives. So I want to read for you guys a quote. This is from Ayan Hirsi Ali, who is a woman who wrote this article called "Why Do I Call Myself a Christian Now?" And her story is fascinating because she converts from the Muslim Brotherhood, a particularly extremist group of Muslims, a particularly devout group of Muslims, and became, when I first heard of her, one of the world's most leading atheist speakers. She was in the likes of Dawkins and all of the new atheists, and she became very outspoken, very well-spoken. She's got tons of TED Talks that you can go find about atheism. And this week, she posted an article called, why do I call myself a Christian now? And so she says this: why do I call myself a Christian now? I would not be truthful if I attributed my embrace of Christianity solely to the realization that atheism is too weak and divisive a doctrine to fortify us against our menacing foes. I've also turned to Christianity because I ultimately found life without any spiritual solace unendurable. Indeed, very nearly self-destructive for me. Atheism failed to answer a simple question: what is the meaning and the purpose of life? Russell and other activist atheists believed that the rejection of God With that, we would enter an age of reason and intelligent humanism, but the God hole, the void that was left by the retreat of the church, has merely been filled by a jumble of irrational, quasi-religious dogma. The result is a world where modern cults prey on the dislocated masses, offering them spurious reasons for being and for action, mostly by engaging in virtue signaling theater on behalf of a victimized minority or a supposedly doomed planet. The line, often attributed to G.K. Chesterton, has turned into prophecy. When men choose not to believe in God, they do not therefore believe in nothing. They become capable of believing in anything. You see, in this nihilistic vacuum, the challenge before us becomes civilizational. Unless we offer something as meaningful, I fear the erosion of our civilization will continue. And fortunately, there is no need to look for some new age concoction of medication and mindfulness. Christianity offers everything that we could need. And that is why I no longer consider myself a Muslim apostate, but a lapsed atheist. Of course, I still have a great deal to learn about this Christianity that I'm part of, and I discover a little bit more at my church each Sunday. So we aren't playing church. We're not snuggling up to a comfortable idea that we're redeemed and we have nothing to do anymore, that we can just sit back and relax because there's no more work to be done. We should be called through this story to go engage the God of the universe who has redeemed humanity at the cross, another unlikely place of redemption. One by one, as people engage this redemption, there is a force that stops evil, it stops sin, it stops Satan in his tracks, and it redeems the world around us. When we unite around the redemption of Jesus and what he offers us, we have something that will save people from the destructive and harmful work of Satan in the world around us. Jesus offers you everything you need and everything that the world needs as he redeems and he renews the world that we live in. Our future on this planet and our future in eternity is at stake. And so the question that I have to end on this morning is this: where do we place our need for redemption today? Because the only way I see that we can find that redemption that we need is by placing our faith and placing our trust in the only Redeemer who's strong enough to hold the weight of what we need. Thank you guys so much for being here this morning. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Sunday and enjoy as we close out with one more song today. Thank you so much. I'm gonna pray real quick. God, we thank you so much for allowing us to be here, to be in your presence this morning, for allowing us to have conversations about you. God, I ask that as we go forward from this place in the rest of our week, that you would give us the strength, the ability to live this out in a way that honors you, to take the helpful and hopeful message of your redemption and use it in a way that pushes us forward into action for the world around us, that redeems the broken and lost world that we live in. God, I ask that you would be here, that you would allow us to be a people who take this out into St. George, into Washington County, into the state of Utah, into our world, that you would heal what needs to be healed, redeem what needs to be redeemed, and that you would allow us to be part of that. We thank you so much for who you are, for the grace that you've given us. And I pray that you would just allow us to continue to celebrate that this morning. We love you. In the name of your son, Jesus, amen.